This episode is brought to you by Our Daily Bread Ministries, a global media organization that makes the life-changing wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to all. Visit whereyou'refrom.org for more information. That's whereyafrom.org.
Welcome to episode 98 of the Grace Enough podcast. I am your host, Amber Cullum, and this week I sit down with Katherine James to discuss her journey of parenting and loving her son through his years of heroin addiction. When her children were young, Katherine would stand at her home's bay window and pray for each one of them while looking out into the sky at Orion's belt. Like many of us, she never dreamed one of her children would become an addict. During our conversation, Katherine talks about how she struggled through being a Christian mom, yet having a child who was battling addiction. She also talks about the beauty and the magnificence of God during some of her darkest days. And then she talks to us about that moment when her feeling of what if became even if. Friends, this is a powerful conversation, one that is so needed in our Christian circles. And so maybe a woman or a man pops into your head when you hear the word addiction. If so, I want to invite you to share this episode with them via text message, email, or maybe share it on your social media page so that anyone in your friend circle has access to it and can be reminded that they are not alone. Not only is God with them, but there are other parents who have walked a path similar to Katherine's. And so let's go ahead and dive into this week's conversation with Katherine James, a son's addiction and a mother's love. Good afternoon, Katherine. Welcome to the Grace Enough podcast. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, as we always do, let's get started by having you introduce yourself and your family to our listeners and tell everybody a little bit about what you do.
Okay, yes. Well, my husband and I work for Crew. He is the publisher for Crew Press, and then I am the acquisitions editor. So mostly we do that, plus 1,000 other things. He speaks quite a bit, and I do some, and write. We both write quite a bit. That's good. Some traveling, but obviously, as of recent, we have not traveled much. And we have 3 kids. Our oldest is in DC, and she's married, and they have a little boy. And then our middle child is in San Francisco. So she's out there working in video editing. And then our youngest is here in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He works in tech, and he's married, and they just had a little baby girl.
Nice. So, well, now, how long have you guys worked for Crew?
Over 30 years. I think
Wow.
like 32 years now. So it's been a long time.
Wow. So yeah, you've been there for all the transition from Crusade to Crew and
Exactly.
I remember when they first started calling it Crew, I was already out of college and I'm like, what is that? And all the young folk, I'm like, oh, that's Campus Crusade for Christ. Yeah. I know what that is.
Yeah.
So.
I know that was a big transition because you have all the older people and then the younger people and.
Well, as you mentioned, you have 3 grown children, and I read your book, and in your book, you write about how you used to stand and pray for them as you would look up at Orion's belt. And so I want to go back to that time and tell us a little bit about those prayers and what your hopes were for your little people, and just a little bit about what your family life with Jesus looked like during that time.
Well, as with so many Christians, we started praying for our kids, the day they were born. So just kind of developed a habit of praying for them. And my prayers were mostly that they'd walk with God. I just wanted them to, just have really vibrant, faithful lives that made a difference in eternity, for eternity. So that's always been my prayer for each of them. And of course, as they get older, those prayers get more complicated because it's not a straight shot from,
That's right.
infancy to adulthood to, being the next, amazing Christian who saves the world. So
That's right.
Life is not as easy as you think it is, obviously. So those changed over time when they went through middle school and, grade school, and you could kind of see what each kid struggled with. Our son struggled with some very specific things like anxiety and depression in different ways. And then, of course, middle school gets more intense. And where is it? I think it's in Bulgaria where they say little children, little problems, big children, big problems.
Yes.
You've probably heard that.
Yes. It's so true. And I still have young children, but I mean, I can see the difference now than 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's just plain true. Unfortunately, I remember hearing that the first time thinking, and I didn't consciously think it because that would have been very prideful. But in my heart, I thought, well, we've been raising our kids right.
Yes.
With Jesus. And
everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll have issues, but it won't be that big because, they're growing up in this great home with a loving father and mother, right?
Yeah.
So things don't always turn out the way you want them to or think they will. So I just remember getting into the habit of praying for them. We have these big bay windows in the front of our living room, like floor to ceiling, huge. And in about January, sometime around then, you can see Orion's belt, the constellation.
Yeah.
And, with Orion's belt, there's these 3 stars. They're just like right in a row. And that just kind of helped me focus. So I remember standing there and just praying for them, in the cold winter. And it was just kind of like my visual cue.
Well, and like you said, they grow up, right? And you start seeing, wow, this one struggles with this. And then you start praying about that. And that kind of adapts over time. And you start seeing the influence of other people in their lives. And I mean, I have to say, that's a big fear of mine that I'm constantly just having to surrender to the Lord. And so for you, you eventually found out that your youngest son was heavily involved in drugs. Talk to us a little bit about that discovery. Like what happened? What were those early months like? Both internally and externally.
Sure. It's a great question. And it's a hard question to answer, honestly. Quite a few people ask me this question about, I'm always a little bit stumped. I think mostly I'm stumped because I think back and I think, how could we not have missed it? I'm not sure what age he was, but honestly, it was just a very, very slow progression as far as us finding out about it, and also for him, I'm sure. So it started out, pot. I'm sure there was drinking involved, but he's never been much of a drinker. So that was never a huge issue, which I'm very grateful for. It was always the drugs and things like that. So our daughter found out he was smoking pot with a couple of his friends, and he was supposed to be in youth group. So she drove over, picked him up, dropped him off at youth group, and then told me what was going on. And actually our other daughter, both of our daughters were involved in letting us know. And so at that point I flipped because this was our son. He would never do this. So
I mean, I think it's a very normal reaction. I don't think that anybody listening says, oh, well, I wouldn't have flipped out or thought, well, wait a minute, God, what? I've been praying for this kid.
Exactly. And the thing too with him, he was always a great kid at home. There wasn't any sense of rebellion or anger. He got along well. He and his dad were probably best friends. So it was very much like, what the heck is going on? So, and the other thing too is that I just kind of intuitively knew because, he was my son, that he wasn't like most kids. It wasn't going to be like, oh, I smoked pot. I just kind of was a stupid thing I did when I was little or younger. But that it could very easily become an addiction for him. And I just knew that enough about him. So,
yeah.
So that was the first obvious thing that happened. And of course, as a parent, you just always want to think the best of your own kids. So it was like in my mind, surely this is just a one-off thing, but then I was being more careful. So I did like search his room and I found something. And at that point, this was later on, it's like, oh, this is definitely an issue. So then, things progressed. He, as far as we knew, he had stopped. We're trying to keep, tabs on things. He was hanging out with a different group of kids at that point. So at that point, it's hard to explain, but we ended up with a lot of kids sort of hanging out at our house, partly because mostly because we wanted to keep tabs on things. We wanted to know what was going on. And, so we got to know these kids. and they were wonderful. And some of them really started walking with God, coming to a Bible study that my husband was having.
Yeah.
And a couple of those kids went over to our son and said, hey, you need to tell your parents what you're doing. And then that's when our son came and sat down with both of us and told us he was doing heroin, which blew my mind. That's the
So
drug.
at this point, though, you had these kids coming and you thought, oh, my son's still just smoking pot and that's it? Or did you know at this point that there were some harder things happening?
We did know there were some harder things happening, and that was part of why these discussions were happening constantly with him, with his friends. We had tested them from time to time. So no, at that point we weren't ignorant, but at the same point, heroin was just...
It's a whole new level.
Yeah, that is a whole new level. Heroin ruins lives. So that was a big blow.
So one of his friends comes and tells you this, and then what? I mean, I know he didn't just stop.
Right. So actually they told him to tell us.
Oh.
So he sat down and told us, which was big, you know.
It is.
And he cried a little bit. So we knew he didn't want to. And at the same point, I'm like, this is an addiction, you know. That's where we're at right now. And so at that point, my first inclination was rehab, you know, because at that point I thought, well, rehab solves everything. That's where you're going right now, today. And thankfully, my husband was a little more thoughtful about it and prayerful about it at that point. And knowing our son, and he was right, that I don't think rehab, I think he would have ran. He wouldn't have stayed even one night probably at that point, just because of some of the other issues he has that were actually, you know, played a part in him using heroin to begin with. So at that point, what we did is we started testing.
And he would allow you to do that? Or was that something where you just said, hey, if you want to stay at home, you need to undergo a test every week?
Yeah.
Or
we didn't say every week. It was random, you know?
Yeah.
And so he was fine with getting tested. And at that point we had at least one other kid staying with us. And so he was getting tested as well, which helped, just knowing, you know, we can always test him.
Yeah. And see what's going on. Well, and I mean, that's the thing. Eventually, again, I mean, he did start using pretty heavily again. And I know that you experienced a lot of guilt as a parent, as we've already kind of talked about. And I think Christian parents in general know that. We think that we've been taught that verse, you know, if you teach your kids in the way they should go, they will not depart from it. And we misuse that verse a whole lot as descriptive. Or maybe I should say as prescriptive. I can't remember which one it is, but in my mind, I know exactly. It's not a promise. That's what I do know.
Right, exactly.
That's right. It's not a promise because we have free will. And so, you know, when you think about that, what was some of the things that you experienced? Just, you know, some of the guilt or the shame that I don't think Christians mean to put. We put it on ourselves. But we also put it on others.
Yeah, we do. That's unfortunate, but we do. Yeah, the shame and guilt. Wow. You know, for me at least, I feel like our whole journey with our son has been almost like a petri dish of the Christian life.
Yeah.
So we all have shame and guilt, whether it's over parenting or anything else. And it's constantly something we have to deal with. So, you know, daily, even now, I have to talk to God about it, believe what's true, trust him, not look back, but look ahead. Like Paul says, press on for the goal, which is in Christ Jesus, which is really perfection is what we want. So we look back and, you know, how do we mess up? So that's been really helpful for me to think in terms of, okay, is this a Christian life? This is what it means to walk with God, and almost in a good way. Well, in a good way, because God was in control. He showed these things to me in very obvious, clear ways that don't look back and look at all your mistakes. You are where you are now. You know, I'm in control even now, even though you've screwed up so much, I'm in control. So that's always been one of my issues, is just regret. So regret. And thankfully my husband that's not his issue. He has others, but he tends to just look forward, like why would that do any good? And he's right. It doesn't really do any good to do that. So thinking in terms of it as, you know, it's part of the Christian life, walking with God. And then also that, you know, looking back doesn't doesn't do anything good.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and that's the thing too. I think to think about how much we desire control. And
mhm,
as Christians, I think anybody feels this way, I believe, maybe some more than others. But as believers, I think sometimes we just have this feeling that we can control things by our
mhm,
prayers. We can control things by the morals we teach.
mhm,
But at the end of the day, we don't control anything.
mhm. No, no. And I think it is, again, back to the Petri dish. It's kind of like the unique thing about drugs is it's unpredictable. That's one of the particularly difficult things about it. Kind of like cancer, you don't know if it's going to come back or not. And while every year that you're away from it is encouragement that it won't, but drugs are the same kind of thing. So there's just this like, I have to trust you. And so
Yeah.
what I'm trusting in isn't the way that things are going to turn out. What I'm trusting in is that you are who you say you are, that you have not lied to me. That's really kind of where my trust ended up ending.
With that, I know there's somebody who's probably listening or knows someone who is
Mm-hmm.
struggling with that guilt and shame right now that, as a
Yeah,
parent, I've failed because my children did X, Y, or Z, or
yeah,
they are living this way.
yeah.
What encouragement would you want to share with them?
First of all, if you have other children who aren't in that same place as that one kid, you're the same parent of that other child, and things didn't turn out that way. There are so many complications in this world.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be something as insignificant as your child's birth weight. These are correlated things with drug abuse. And when I started looking into that, some of the science of it and the
Yes.
correlations that are involved, and I thought, wow, my son ended up having, I think, 4, which,
Yeah.
at
I
first,
remember reading that part
light
and
was,
thinking, oh my gosh, this is like, I shouldn't be reading this because, know,
no,
I had a 10-pound,
what is
4
this?
ounce baby. Oh my gosh.
Oh, you did?
I
Sorry about
did. No,
that.
no, no, no. But that's a good point. We don't get to control it. That doesn't
Mm-mm.
mean he's going to turn out to be that way because, yes, it could, but it's
Yeah.
not, I can't control that.
No. And that's something that might be interesting to know, once you do have a child who's struggling, to kind of know what some of the precursors are,
Yeah,
what predisposes a kid to these sorts of things. So that's
that's
helpful.
right.
Yeah. So I think, like I've said, just don't focus on the past. Really double down on believing God is who he says he is, go back. There's a reason it says over and over, and I can't remember the Psalm. Maybe you can. His loving kindness endures forever.
Mm-hmm.
You know
Yep.
where that is? So it just
Mm-hmm.
over and over. It's just like overkill. What are
It really
and
is.
it is. And I think the purpose is just, it's in glorifying himself, but it's also because he wants us to know, like, if you didn't get this time, his loving kindness endures forever. Oh, wait, maybe you missed it. His loving kindness endures forever. And so these sorts of things just are so important when you're going through any kind of a struggle, because
Mm,
what we're asked to do is believe who he says it is. I mean, that's faith. Faith is
yeah.
trust. And if we're trusting that God is, okay, you just said that to me, that you love me, I'm going to believe you love me. And so during those times when things are really, really hard, and you're looking out the window, you're waiting for the phone call to come, all these things that could potentially happen to your child, which is a very, very hard struggle when your kids are involved. So, just going back to those truths and believing that God's also telling you this because he wants it you personally to believe it. It's not just some sort of blanket statement, but that
Right.
it's, he's focusing on you.
Well, and that's the thing about, knowing the character of God. And I think, too, it says it over and over again because David and other psalmists who were writing it, they had to speak it over themselves because sometimes in that moment, they weren't believing it either.
Yes. Yes.
And so it's like your love, your loving kindness, whichever your translation says,
Mm-hmm.
endures forever. I may not feel like it right now, but
Yes.
forever.
Right. Right.
And so that is a far different characteristic than right now.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And what you just said is key too. I may not feel it right now,
Mm-hmm.
but I believe it,
Yes, yes. Well, your home did become this place, this hangout, this, maybe I shouldn't refer to it as a revolving door, but kids were coming in and out, and most of them were addicts. And you all referred to them lovingly as the lost boys. And so, what are some things that you learned from opening your home, to boys who were walking through addiction?
Yeah. Well, you learn these different stories, and each of them are so interesting and unique, and not the type of thing that you would expect from the kid on the street. It used to be, honestly, I passed a kid on the street who was obviously not doing well, just, whatever. I figured he's probably on drugs, and, without consciously doing it, I was still judging, assuming things,
Yeah.
And so from these kids, just like, yeah, you know what? God's saying, these are not kids to judge. These are kids to love more than the next even. I mean, it could feel that way anyway. Just so many of them from loving homes, parents who prayed for them constantly. And yeah, they were just really just beautiful, beautiful kids. And God gave us such a love for each of them. And, you could see how different each of their spirits were, and the different ways that God got into their lives and changed them. And now, as some of them are truly thriving, we can see like their gifts, and it's just so fun. They might come and visit, and, one will probably go into translations because, go figure, he's really, really good at linguistics. He went to Biola through all of this. Yeah. And then another one ended up at Biola too, and he's just brilliant at building houses and missions. So he ended up going into missions, and I think he's getting his master's right now. But and then another one who's just a phenom. He has a podcast. He's great. Just brilliant, brilliant, brilliant kid. You see these things, and some of them are, around town doing great, working, and,
right.
But just such an honor to be able to be in their lives and somehow, some way make a difference. My husband is very involved with them, each of them. He would spend time with each of them individually at different points through the Bible study, have these conversations that would go on all night. I didn't have what it would take to do that. I would make brownies at the most because I'm not a cook.
So that's what the box is for.
I know, right? I know. Thank you.
Yeah. No shame. They taste just as good.
I know. So that was just a gift to us, honestly, to see all these things happen.
I mean, I have to ask, because I hear you say that about your husband. I mean, how did he even get them to consider talking about the Bible?
He is a really, really, really loving God. And he, listen to me, Freudian slip there, loving God. No, loving guy. And he just, was drawn to them. And our kids have always had their friends around. We've always had a very open home. Oftentimes somebody will be staying with us, like a friend in seminary or something. So we had that kind of a home anyway, but he just had a way with them. I think he's funny. He's a philosopher. He has,
So he loves those deep conversations.
PhD. Yeah. And I think kids really took on to that. It was something interesting to talk about. And of course, drugs could easily be a part of that conversation too.
Yeah.
So there was that as well. And I'm sure a lot of it had to do with the parents and friends who were praying for these kids, that they would have a place to go to, someone to talk to, that sort of thing. And not all of them, all of them didn't have that, but I think that played a big part. And I think it's just the fact that Christ was just part of our home already, and people knew what they were getting into.
Yeah.
If you're going to stay here, this is what it's about, kind of thing. So I think that was part of it.
I just think it's so awesome to hear that that happens, right? Because so often I think that what comes to mind is, if it's a Christian home, we're keeping all the bad out so that we can stay good.
Yeah.
Because, that's what keeps you good, is to keep all the bad out.
That was a part. Yeah. I mean, that's probably
which is not true.
No, it's not. Of course, you don't want anybody actively using in your house.
That's right.
So it was really, at a certain point, Rick was like, this one kid, loved him so much, and he didn't make it. He was just precious, and Rick felt like he should be able to come and stay, and I said no. So he didn't, and I don't think that's why he died, but it's still just beyond tragic. It's just really, really sad. So, yeah, and the reason that he couldn't stay is just because he was too close to heroin. He had quit, but, maybe a week earlier, and I just wasn't comfortable with that.
How many years did this go on?
Gosh, 4 maybe.
Okay.
Didn't kind of stop and start. It was gradual, but
Right.
about that.
Yeah, where people were in and out.
Yeah.
Well, and even as I hear you talk about this kid that lost his life, I mean, when I read your book, I mean, first of all, your words, you're a brilliant writer. You know how to put the emotion in, the truth in, some facts with the story. It was really a beautiful story. But I could really feel the weight of the evil of drugs and just what it robs people of. But then there was always this thread of beauty and magnificence. And so you've shared that a little bit, but how did you see in the midst of all this sadness, this thread of beauty and magnificence?
Yeah.
At the time, because I know now that people have become believers and you see them thriving, it's so much easier probably to look back at that time.
Yeah, it is. That's a really good question. And another one that's hard to kind of pinpoint, but at the same time, I think, people talk about being able to see light because we know darkness, that kind of a thing. So the lifestyle of a drug addict and the whole drug world is darker than anything I've experienced before. Like if you go into a city and the things you see, you might see, kids or people on the sidewalk, curled up high. And, there are places in Philadelphia where they'll just push people who have overdosed to the side because they don't want the cops to come, who are dead. Things like that, where you're just like, Satan has got his hand all over this. And so when you're experiencing that kind of darkness and seeing it and getting a glimpse of it, of course, when you see a glimpse of God, of his power and majesty overcoming these things that seem so completely helpless, it just blows your mind at his majesty, because there's so much involved in the things he does. There has to be love there. There has to be power there. There has to be goodness. There has to be him knowing us uniquely and creating us the way he created us. There's just so much involved. And then there were also specific times where we saw things where God was, I don't know why, we're not even charismatic for the most part, but like saw things like my husband saw an angel,
Yeah.
And I had some really intense, I don't know what to call them, dream visions. So that just carried me through so much. And just this sense of God is here. He's not out there and we're begging him to be involved, but he's eager to listen to our prayers, and he is involved. And we can look back now and see things. And, it's weird. I was thinking about the other day, even that it was those precious times were almost to the point where I want to go back.
I think that's so strange.
I was in horrible pain. And if I had to check a box, I'd check no, please. Thank you. But those times were just beautiful.
Yeah. He really saw God's work. Well, and your son survived.
Yeah. See, he did. He really
and that's
did.
not everybody's story. And there was a lot of times you weren't sure if it was going to be your story.
Yeah. We were sure at a certain point. I was sure it wasn't going to be our story of him living. So, and I've never felt so compassion for parents who do lose a child as I did after experiencing this. I mean, you always feel compassion for anybody who has to go through that, but
but there is a different, when you've come really close or have lost a child, the amount of empathy and compassion you have is different. It's a different dose. It's a different level than someone who hasn't walked through or walked that path. Well, let's close with the moment when, what if became even if my sweet boy overdoses on heroin, everything will be okay. What was that experience like?
Yeah. Well, it was during such a heart-wrenching, intense time that I came to that realization that I kind of remember every specific thing. You know how sometimes your visual, if you're going through trauma or whatever, your visual and things that are going on around you kind of like freeze, like you see it. You know, car crash, you freeze at this certain place and you see what's happening. So this happened in the midst of this realization I had happened in the midst of his, he had 2 overdoses. This was the most serious of one because he went into septic shock and was in a coma. And he, it was when were trying to revive him. And then the ambulance had just gotten to the emergency room and they were, pushing him down the hall. And then so my husband and I went to the elevators to take them up to the ICU once they were able to get him in there and stable him enough to make it in there. And then a bunch of his friends were there by then, friends who were walking with God, and we were all praying. And we were in the elevator and I looked up and all I could think up until then was, what if he dies? What if he dies? What if he does? How am I going to handle this? How am I going to get through this? And looking up at the numbers and they're changing and little dings going on. And it just kind of like a ding in my head. It's like, even if just came to my mind, even if the worst happens, that's the only thing that's going to cover all the bases is even if, because anything could happen. There isn't anything that's predictable in any part of this world. And so the only piece we have is to say, even if this does happen, I'm going to be okay. And that's through Christ. And that was the only way I knew I was going to be okay, is that even if my son dies, I will still go to heaven. God is in control. He knew what he was doing. And that's a hard pill to swallow. But once you swallow it, it has a healing effect. So I went back to that a lot,
Wow.
So by the time I got up to ICU and saw him, I had that. And before that, I didn't have that. So.
Wow. Well, yeah. And I mean, what does life look for you all now? You said you have, how many grandkids do you have? Or was your
2.
Okay.
Yes.
And so your son just had his first one?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And so if you all are still serving with Cru and you only have one child near home.
We have no children in our home.
No, one child near home. I'm sorry.
Near home.
In the area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
Goodness.
do.
That's crazy. So do you get to travel to see the other ones much?
Just the one in DC. So that's been nice. Our daughter, the one that is in California, doesn't have kids and she's not married yet. So, or, she might not get married. I don't know. So we see the other 2 a lot more, but yeah.
That is so awesome. Well, if people tell everybody, of course, that the name of your book is A Prayer for Orion, is there a place if someone wanted to connect with you that they can?
Definitely. You can go to my website. It's katherinejameshome.com. So it's KATHERINE James.home.com.
Awesome.
And I'm fine. I get emails every once in a while from somebody who just needs prayer, and that's absolutely fine. And that's Katie, KATIE.James@CRU.org.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Katherine, for sharing your story with us.
I really appreciate it.
Katherine's memoir, A Prayer for Orion, is one of my favorite reads of 2020. You can find it linked under the show notes tab at graceenoughpodcast.com. And while you're there, I have 3 free Christmas wall art downloads for you through December 31st, 2020.
Thank you for listening to the Grace Enough Podcast. Tune in next time.